happiness misconception as a topic for us is that there are so many different angles and so many different views that we figured that if we bring some of the theory together and some of the history and then maybe open up the conversation as to how people think that this can be done and how it can be used in the world of data science, then we'll be able to hopefully start a separate thread of conversation around the topic. So it's by no means complete. It's by no means in its, if you think about all the different topics in all the branches of this research, in any way supposed to be a totally comprehensive view. This is one angle that we thought we could get through in the hour and a bit that we have to work through this. So just so that you know that in the background, that's what we probably see that. So the first thing is that we want to just think about why this is a topic worth discussing and why this is something that we want to research. And we want to just outline some parts of the problem. We want to look at some of the options to consider if you want to think about how this is going to affect your world in either research in the humanities or research in the data science world. And then we want to think about some of the solutions that by no means is complete today. The idea of today was to present one or two examples that are purely biased in our view. And when we get to the pieces that are completely biased, I'll tell you. So I'm inducing bias for our own purposes, if you guys are okay with that. So to start off with the context of the problem, what I want to do is run a mini exercise with you all if you are interested in this. I'm going to do 2 surveys that are probably going to take you about 30 seconds to complete. And when the results come back, I want to share it with everybody and just show you something that often happens in this kind of field. So what I will do in the chat is I'm pasting a link there that is a link to a standard Google Doc that you can just go and capture the survey. And the survey is entirely anonymous. So you can put in whatever you like. You can, if you know, how you feel today and how you think about the world, if you could please fill it in. And if we can get just some result, I want to then share it with everybody because nobody's going to know what you said and how you said it. It's a survey that's completely anonymous. Okay, happiness survey. Let's load the results. How many responses do we have? We've got 24 responses. Okay, in most ways, my life is close to ideal. 1 said 1 and 2 said 5 and the rest said 2. Then we had 1 said 1, 2 being primary number, 3, 4, 5. And the conditions of my life are excellent. Then I'm satisfied with my life. 1, 2 again, and then, oh, that's interesting, 3, 4. And then so far I've gotten the important things I want in life. 2, and then only 1, 5, 1, 3 ones, or at least 3 5s and 3 1s. And then I could live my life over. If I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. And you can see that was a pretty evenly distributed result.
Does it matter which side of the spectrum is the strongly agree or the strongly disagree?
So this is strongly agree and strongly disagree. So that means almost everybody said that if you look at the questions, the question is strongly agree, strongly disagree. So that means 2. And I made it specifically like that so that people will just think about the fact that you normally think that 5 is strongly agree. Just to kind of twist it around. Okay, so basically, yeah, that means that most people think about their lives seem to be okay. They're dealing with it. So they think that happiness is okay. But almost more than half of everybody in this community said that if they could change something, they would change almost nothing. So they strongly disagree. So that's also quite interesting. Okay, so what I want to do now gives you essentially a partial view of the evidence that you would need as a social scientist or as a computational social science researcher. So that means that it's typically very difficult to just go and find out how people truly feel about their lives, what they're really doing, and also the things that make them happy or unhappy. So that means that you might find that there's maybe something to do with the weather that makes you unhappy, but the food makes you happy. So that means that the way in which you conduct your life is incredibly difficult to find in surveys. And if you look at the first survey, if you had to take most of those questions and answers, there's very little that you would be able to do with that specifically to take any real action. And even with the second survey, the question is, what will you do to make the people that are unhappy happy? What we have found is that there's typically a problem in the way that a lot of this research gets done, and also how people engage with a lot of this kind of content, because there's just so much of it, so much available. So what I thought I'll do is to keep the soft side going, is show you a 2-minute clip by Alan Watts. And Alan Watts just talk about what you desire, and then we'll get into a little bit of the detail just after that. Watch this, and then we can chat about what that means afterwards.
What makes you itch?
I'm not sure how many of Alan Watts' work, but I always enjoy his clarity on things and how he sees the world. And if you think of happiness and what people truly desire and not desire, is a complex topic as it is, isn't it? And if you just go to Google, and this is always a great response because Google publishes these kind of short snippets, but if you had to say the number of people that are unhappy, it will quickly give you a result and say to you that more people are unhappy out there than the people that are happy. They feel about the world very differently than what we think they feel about. This is coming out. So 86% of Americans are pretty unhappy. It's the lowest since the earlier 70s. And there are studies in Europe showing the same, and nobody cares about Africa. Basically, it is because why should anybody be thinking about this other than the companies who are going to try to solve this problem for you? So what you've seen is that 80% of customers have stopped doing business with companies because they feel that their customers have bad experience, or the fact that they were unhappy with the service. So we know that it is a truly dominant and a prominent topic, and it affects our lives, but yet there's such limited kind of research, especially in the world of computational social science. What we're seeing is that if so many people are unhappy, and we know that we are definitely not happier than what we used to be before, what is being done, and how do we see this? What is the research that's showing us, and what are we doing about it? What are the interventions and the nudges and all the actions that we need to take to solve this problem? So that means that we don't know what the symptoms and the causes are. We have no understanding, because most of the work that gets done in this space is the fact that it's qualitative. We kind of extrapolate based on what we think is happening around us rather than what the real facts are. So the research in the field basically shows that happiness as a subject cover very few true social quantitative factors, but it's mostly around the fact that we study the general concepts. We're generalizing what we think is happening from the observation of a researcher. We know that in the quantitative research view, we know that there's research across geography and time periods, and trying to understand with most of the world happiness studies that there are changes from time to time. And we know that during the pandemic, there were enormous kind of changes in a lot of those metrics at a quantitative level. At a qualitative level, things like culture and identity and emotions are almost impossible in the context of traditional research to extrapolate, because all those studies purely qualitatively extrapolated from a particular situation. And we think that you need to rethink that and find an hypothesis that you can potentially calculate happiness from data points that are being created, so that you can truly find out if people are in a state of mind that you think that they are in. So the other thing is that there is a discipline. And if you think of behavioral economics, the original name is the happiness economics. It's basically saying that there's the world of economics, and if you include the human, and the human is happy, the human will spend more. And I think that is the basis of how a lot of our research is driven today, is the fact that the only truly objective measure that we have at the moment is spending. And if you think of places like the US and Europe, Canada, Australia, or even in most parts of Africa, the regions like these, you have only that measure. You measure a country's success on its ability to produce and get its participants to participate actively. So the challenges are these. If you had to think about happiness in the context of a social problem, is that the Oxford Handbook of Happiness give a specific description saying that the most comprehensive handbook of happiness ever published is psychological, philosophical, evolutionary, economic, spiritual, and then they publish nothing about social science. So they give you this broad spectrum of how they think the world of happiness works, because happiness, according to most of this research, is a psychological individual phenomena. So it's almost like you cannot be happy as a society or a small collective in the context of some of the ways in which this is seen. In the American Journal of Sociology, it says it's the most comprehensive handbook on happiness ever published, but it only includes a handful of views. In actual fact, in some of the books, it doesn't include any sociological research or critique on the specific topic of happiness. And then being a complete reference guide has no mention of any form of social science. That means there is no mention of how a collective or even the context of a family unit, how it feels about its happiness as a collective and the influence of members of, say, a family on each other. And then the World Book of Happiness, they've got 100 plus researchers across countries all over the world, and they only have a few sociological contributions. There are only a handful of papers published showing you the fact that, hang on, maybe there should be a dimension in the context of social science that should be considered. So we now know that if you think of the kind of two opposite ends of the humanities, the field of how we see the individual psychologically as an individual is fairly well researched, an enormous amount of work going into that. We see the world of anthropology and the understanding of broader societal shifts. We see that the World Happiness Study will tell us at a very broad spectrum what's going on, but there's very little work being done around just saying how a particular community will function. Now, in the business world, it's not quite like that, because there's a big focus on customer happiness and employee happiness and fields like those that we don't really reference here today. We can maybe have that in one of our follow-up meetups, talk about that as a specific kind of focus. So let's just think about the history. You know, the Durkheim, from his very early days of talking about global consciousness, had this whole construct that social cohesion is really something that is the basis of how you feel about your life and the basis of happiness. So that means that you will often measure how you feel and how happy you are in relation to other people. So that means that we need measures and we need data points to understand how people feel in relation to others. And I think that's why the world behind social media and so on have become so prominent in the world we live in today, is because the way that we sometimes measure if we are important or if we fit is by purely looking at how other people see us. And that means that it's a very narrow focus on a very few companies controlling a lot of those data points. So the other part of it is, if you think of the whole intellectual and moral crisis that people sit with, and saying that, do you think that an entire society is in pursuit of happiness? Because if you think of, in the world study of happiness, there's one study that shows that Costa Rica at the moment is the most happy society in the world, and there's another study showing that maybe there's other societies in the East that are the happiest societies, and they're all conflicting. They don't give us a view exactly as to what makes that community really happy. The other thing is that Simmel, as a researcher, focused almost entirely on individualism. He says that if you feel that you are important as an individual in a society, you will be happy. So that means that if you go to school and your friends like you, you're happy. If you're in a family and you get along with your family members, you're happy. So the focus is very much on individualism. Weber was really much focused on this kind of ethic around the fact that it's the choices that you take, and then what you do is you want to give people a way in which they can think for themselves and they can drive their own thinking. And then Marx is probably one of the most classics. He basically said that capitalism and the whole focus on alienation clearly make people unhappy. Because if you think about it, in the social sciences, you got one part of the world that researched happiness up until probably, about 100 years ago, 80 years ago. And then you got, in a modern world, most people only researching what makes people unhappy as a focus. So that means in the social sciences, from a traditional point of view, it's almost like we are brought up to say that there is no other goal in life that commands such a higher degree of consensus, and that is the fact that all that you are in pursuit of is a happy life. So that means that you're almost being brought up and being educated that this is what you're supposed to focus on, even though you might be a personality that if you are unhappy about something, you might actually feel pretty happy. That there is no definition that describes that or that understands that. So that means that, sociologists and the social sciences is really interested in human behavior. And that means that if you take the behavior, is there a way that you can match various types of emotions? So that means that, is there a way in which we can drive some connection between those two? And is there a way in which we can give answers around those two? And most sociologists will think that the study of happiness is really just somebody that is like a whimsical state of mind. It's immeasurable and it's pointless because we can't create a specific angle that can give us some kind of quantitative view on it. And then at the end of it, just like love, happiness is knowable only intuitively at the level of feeling. And that's what is quite common in the social science world. It's basically saying that this is unresearchable. Why are you even attempting to solve this problem? If you look at even before that, early days of going from the 60s into early modern life, the whole concept was around, is there a way that you can understand how people can get to a state of happiness? So if you had to run this survey that we ran earlier with people who were refugees, or we had to run it with people that came out of a war-stricken community, or people who are incredibly poor and couldn't put food on their table this morning, or people who have just been hurt, or people who have been affected by some condition, what would the result be? And what would you be able to do to alter their situation? What nudge, intervention, interaction would you be able to put in place to alter their state of mind to move into something else? So The Art of Life, published probably around the 70s, talks about the fact that consumerism promised a happy life. That means that you go do some shopping and you spend some money and you'll be happy because you'll be able to get some more goods that you've got no idea what to do with it, but you'll be able to get all of this additional, product that has been designed to enlighten you, and you'll be able to have a happy life. So we're kind of seeing that you're trapped in this endless search for a better life. That's that whole pursuit, and how do you deal with that? The other thing is that we want to make sure that we understand what the socioeconomic conditions are and how we handle those socioeconomic conditions. And then how do you deal with the kind of research that normally would need to take place if you wanted to research, as an example, your employees feel, how your family feels, how your clients feel about what they are engaging with you on, and are they happy or not? And obviously, there are a number of studies that give us some view on how that works. But I think that the biggest and primary thing in the world of social science is that there's this preoccupation with misery. It means that you want to kind of research when things go wrong and when there are deep unhappiness within a society, rather than trying to truly understand the opposite of that. Is that what are those fundamental drivers that make people happy? So what makes this complicated is that firstly, there are many competing theories and approaches. There are different ways in which you need to solve this. Human behavior and emotional research is largely contradictory. So that means that you can't just use one particular theory to solve a particular problem. You almost have to open, the way in which you deal with this. You find that the research in the field is mostly driven by human interpretation, and that the fact that the data points that are being collected are still basically in the early days of how we can interpret that to come up with new theoretical constructs. And then finding human subjects to participate in studies with you, in control studies, is a very difficult thing to do, because the problem with Dr. Heisenberg uncertainty principle is that once you've participated in a person's life on this topic of happiness, you have contaminated your subject, and that means that your entire observation becomes something that you can't really work with. So that means that you need to find alternative methods of data collection, and it's almost like the researcher needs to move from the field of sociology and social science into computational social science, and you need to come up with a new theory of what happiness could mean, and use that new theory of what happiness means in the context of a particular control test. And you just want to know that the measure of what you are trying to fix or what you are trying to influence has had a positive impact. And that then drives the kind of thinking typically. So that means that how do you translate then this pursuit of happiness, if it's a quantitative problem, into a technology? What does that mean? Does a technology mean that you got somebody asking better questions, somebody providing with better tools, somebody tracking you in a way that you can participate? What does that really mean in the context of the world of technology? Anyway, so that was just some parts of the context of the problem. Okay, so let's just talk about some options. And because we wanted to leave most of this open for conversation, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So let's just think about what Aristotle said. He said, learning to live a good life and to be happy requires effort, time, and dedication like any other prowess. So that means that basically what he says is that you just have to work at it. So the question is there a way that we can collect a data point knowing that people are working at becoming happy? So could it mean that if somebody buys a certain product, somebody drives a certain route to work, somebody goes on a certain holiday, somebody eats a certain food rather than the food that they don't want to eat, or go to a holiday that they prefer than the one they don't go to, that they are in a better state of being happiness? Because the biggest crisis, one of the big crises with happiness, is that it cannot be a continuous state of mind. Because the problem is, as soon as you're very happy, you feel that it wears off, and you have to be unhappy to become happy again. So that creates a complex cycle. So that means that happiness has been and is today some context of skill that must be learned, if you think of the kind of really historical view of how people see this. So one of the big misconceptions, and this is from a researcher publishing this recently, saying that happiness is that the path to happiness involves avoiding pain. So we think that if you remove pain, then you'll be fine. And that means that the pain is actually a necessary part of happiness. And that's the unfortunate side effect. So that means that could you measure and make your definition of happiness that happiness is the absence of pain? And can you make the definition of pain, that pain is defined as the absence of happiness? And if you think about what pain is there a way that you can turn it into a data point or into something that becomes measurable that you can actually use in some way that is useful to you in your business or whatever you want to achieve? Now, Marx and Durkheim have argued that in modern societies have designed themselves around the fabrication to try to deal with how we make people happy. And if you think about novelty as one of the fundamental drivers of happiness, is that you fabricate new wishes and needs. So that means that instead of asking somebody a question about what they're going to like next, what you do is you kind of create something for them. You put them in a situation where that once you've educated them on this new idea, that they will love it more than the idea that was there before. And if you do that, and they feel that they do not have access to that new idea, they will feel unhappy. And that means that in the pursuit of happiness, people will then go and find whatever that product is, that service, whatever it is that now is seemingly accessible, they will want access to it. And once they have access to it, they will be happy temporarily. So it's like an ongoing cycle. And if you think of a lot of modern economic systems are almost built on the back of this phenomenon. So that means that while we're trying to encourage individualistic lifestyle and we think that this is how people become happy, the focus really has been so far on consumerism. And that means that you buying stuff. And that means that if you don't buy stuff, you are not happy. So the question is, why is that the case? And we found that the reason why it's so prominent is because there are just so many different ways in which you can now use your existing data points and your existing ways in which you know that you are economically engaging with your customers and turn those into meaningful data sets. The problem is, most people still think that you need to run a survey, and the survey is going to tell you exactly. And I bet you that if you have to go look at the actual data points around how people behave against what they say they feel, there are massive mismatches between those two. So Yuval's got a great way of looking at it. He said the basic reaction of the human mind to pleasure and to achievement is not satisfaction, it's the craving for more. Because once you know that you have access, once you know that you can achieve and do something, you immediately feel that you need to get more. And the problem is, what does enough mean? At what point do you know that you have enough? Because once you have too much, you will be unhappy with the fact that this is now available in abundance. So that means that anything that's in scarcity makes you unhappy, and once you have a little bit of it, you are happy. And once you take it away, then you're unhappy again. So there's this ongoing cycle of how we see people drive towards this craving of engagement. So for those who are interested in TED Talks, you know that there's a whole conversation around how do you find happiness and how do you create it. And the biggest part of it is that some people are saying you can't. It's something you should be told to be happy. You should be involved in communities that will drag you into their world and they will make you happy. Because if you are inherently in a pessimistic society and a pessimistic community and a community that is hateful all the time, you will fall in the trap of that community. So that's why we start thinking that it's a social science problem, in some cases more so than a psychological problem or even an anthropological problem. The other thing is that if you look at studies that have been done on the history of happiness, and if you look at Robert Waldinger, I'm not sure if anybody has followed his studies, they did basically a study over 80 years with males and how they changed through their lives. And if you think about it, only one major phenomena emerged as the thing that made people truly happy, and that is their social connections. It's the way in which they connect themselves and the way they find their fit within a community. So the question is, what is that community? Is that community a family? Is it a team? Is it a company? Is it a sports team? Is it a club that you belong to? Is it the people that you travel with as travel buddies? What is that community? And then how does that affect your mindset? So that means that we now know that in the context of the social studies, that this has become a very prominent topic to think about. So here's a practical rendition of this. And it's a case study for those who've heard it before. I've been researching this for too many years, but this is the thinking. Do you think that Nokia customers leading up all the way to like 2006 or 7 were very unhappy? I don't know. Anybody got a view on that? I don't know if anybody ever thought about...
I was a very happy Nokia customer.
And the thing was, why were you happy? Because they listened to you all the time. So that meant that they ran surveys and they kept on asking you questions. And every time somebody asked you a question or Nokia ran a survey, you would say, the device is not so useful because I'm a sportsman. I want a device that is good for sport. I want a device that's good for playing games or media. I want a device that is good for just running around a week because your battery used to last an entire week. Remember those days when you could charge your battery on a Monday and the next Monday it will still have a tiny bit of battery life left. So that meant that this organization became completely focused on a definition of happiness that says we need to listen to people. And once we listen to them, we need to react to what they're telling us. And the consequences are problematic. Now, the wave after that, what started creating a problem is that what you really wanted and what really made you happy was not somebody coming to you asking your opinion. It was somebody that could test ideas with you and push out the boundaries and figure out where the boundaries of most of a community's views would lie. And the challenge sometimes is that people don't do that. So the consequence was that when Microsoft created the Microsoft device, this is Steve Ballmer and one of the Microsoft devices, they basically said that happiness for a digital user is having a keyboard and having some familiarity with the software that they have on their phone and the software that they have on their desktop. And it needs to be almost the same. And you want to be able to use a keyboard because a keyboard is the anchor of happiness on a device. And when Steve Ballmer got interviewed and asked questions about how I felt about this, I don't know if anybody has ever seen that conversation that Steve Ballmer had when he was asked about the iPhone. I didn't even know Microsoft made a phone. I think, that's probably before your time. Because at the time when that interview was done, they basically had 85% of the market. So let's just think about it here for a moment. So that meant that the research that was done at the time around how we see product and technology, and especially how people are either happy or unhappy with their devices, had a very specific philosophical view of how people saw that. So by the time Apple came along and presented their story, and I'm just going to show 10 seconds of this and show you the difference in opinion. The opinion was that everything was the only way that we measure happiness is by the fact that the market showed us. People are buying phones. We've got so many millions of phones. We've got so much of the market share. We've got all of the controls entirely around the economic measures. Where the thing that started causing some trouble was the fact that how do you compete with an emotional driver? So just listen to this for maybe just a few seconds of this talk.
Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. And Apple has been, first of all, one's very fortunate if you get to work on just one of these in your career. Apple's been very fortunate. It's been able to introduce a few of these into the world. In 1984, we introduced the Macintosh. It didn't just change Apple.
This is style of how it was presented. So it was very much driven around the emotion of connectivity, basically saying that in the era of listening and in the era of observing how people behave based on what they tell you that they want, we know that happiness was something that we exerted through somebody asking us questions. In the era that came after that, and I just see there's some comments around like BlackBerry and so on as well, was that you basically did not just listen, but you took ideas from different places and you defined market happiness and customer happiness around how you can invent what they do, and you then measure everything that you do almost entirely on sales. But we now live in an era where there's an emotional dimension. And the emotional dimension transcends just the fact that it's economically driven. It's not just about the numbers and about how you have purchased it. It's because you've got so many different options. It's about the one that brings an entire ethos around what it and how it engages with its customer base. Excuse me. So that means that we now know that there's no agreement on how this gets done. You find that there are still enormous effort on just running like research campaigns and interviews and all sorts of mechanisms to keep on finding out what people want and then only using economic measures. But we know that all of us are busy shifting into a world where the choices that we want to make and how we get enlightened by the companies who's going to provide us with new kind of innovative products that will make us happy need to be far more specific and engaging than what they used to be. So let's just think about a couple of solution options, because I know we run out of time unless I get through this quickly. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, and this is the section that's biased for those that are okay with that. I'm just going to give you a quick view of how we see this. So one of the ways we see it is that you really want to have a world of computational social science covering the broader population of research and the technicalities of what you want to focus on. So that means that you want to have an understanding of the social sciences, and that means that you want to understand the anthropological, the psychological, and the elements of how it works within smaller communities being social science. You want to understand how that works and how that fits together, and you might want to use some ways to include the data that was collected in the context of a qualitative approach. In the computer science world, you want to make sure that you've got the tooling and the mechanisms by which you can test many of these theories. So you want to bring it together in computational social science. So you want to have ways in which you can find mappings of the algorithms in the social science world and human behavioral constructs and map it onto a technological deployment platform. And that means that as a human behaves and as a human engages throughout its lifetime with whatever service, product, and if you think of a service like a telephony service or a banking service or a transportation service, or in a product when you go purchase a bed or a television set or a computer, the point is that at that point of you engaging, you want to have something that you can either collect from that customer or provide them with an option to say that I now know how this person is feeling about what they've just done, or how they're feeling before they get to do what they need to get to do. So that means that you need real-time capabilities to be able to amplify your social science models. And that means that you want to have a way in which you can bring all of these elements together in a technologically deployable environment using social science capabilities. And we're big proponents of that for those kind of ecosystem style of working. So that means that if you had to take another example, something like music, that's been a long field of study for me. I find it very intriguing how this works. But music is a major key to happiness. This is a study published here. I've got the reference, and when I send out the notes, I'll make sure that we put all the references for the different slides in there so people can go and have a look at it. So think about music in the context of being therapeutic and the way in which we seem, or at least feel, about music that is really great in our lives. So the first thing is lyrics affects people. So lyrics can be used to create nostalgia. It can be used to create a sense of feeling that under normal conditions will not be that easy to create unless you had a tune in your ear or something that you can relate to. So that means that the way in which music alleviates pain and keep our brain healthy and improve our mood and all the characteristics that have been done through research, and for those who are interested can go read this report afterwards. But basically what we're seeing now is that there is an impact of a media platform like music on your behavior. So that means that if you could track how somebody listens to music in the context of their car or the context of their home or wherever they are, you want to be able to act on that media. So could you have a scenario where if you're busy on a WhatsApp chat to somebody and that there's music playing in the background, that you'll be able to track what the mood is of that person's chat in relation to their music, or somebody is performing a banking transaction or they're busy doing a purchase. Could we start bringing all of these dimensions together? And we're seeing that the data points that are being created to make it, that connection between what we do and how we feel means that we're going to have to create a diverse influence of data around us. In this example, if you had to take somebody like Spotify, and we covered this in one of our previous talks, but maybe just quickly see this, is that what Spotify does, they take a song, they carve it up, and they break it up into the rhythm, the beat, the lyric, and they basically try to figure out what your mood is. And that means that how do you feel about the things that are happening around you? And what they do is they carve up the music into transactions, they categorize those transactions, and then what they do is they then map it back to your behavior. So that means that the act of categorizing somebody's life is the essence of the basis of where you do a lot of your behavioral related research from, and also where you can construct your happiness hypothesis. So in this case, if you're going to want to drive happiness from your data, here's one example of that. What you want to do is you want to understand the social system that you're analyzing. You want to understand how and why people will engage with you. And you might do qualitative studies to give you an angle to see this is why people do what they do. You also want to understand what those centralities are around what kind of things people do. So if you work in the context of a telephony environment, you want to understand what kind of service, what kind of interaction, what time of interaction, how do people engage. In the context of a bank, what people spend money on and how they spend it over time. In the context of a retail store, when people enter, how much time they spend. So that means that understanding of human movement in the context of the time dimension is critically important in the context of the categorization. So you need to bring time and categorization into the same phenomena. And one way in which we've done it is something like this, where you want to have a theoretical view on personality. So you want to be able to find a way to engage with people based on personality. And you also want to be able to understand on other behavioral characteristics, where in this case, what does habitual behavior look like in the context of action planning? So do you know if people take action that they will be happy? So if somebody is highly action-oriented and they don't have an opportunity to take an action, they will probably feel unhappy. If somebody is more of a procrastinator and you force them to take an action, they will be equally unhappy. You want to be able to give them an opportunity to get their minds around the things that you're going to offer them and not just push them into that final action or that final sale or that final change you want them to make. So you want to keep that fairly dynamic. And that means that you need analysis methods to figure out what all the things are that will make up all the base categories of spend. And here's an example from South Africa. And eventually what you want to do is you want to have a time dimension to measure the actions that people take over time to get to this concept called sentimental equilibrium. So that means that the state of happiness is at the perfect point where you are sufficiently unhappy to know what it feels like to be happy. And that is largely part of this misconception that we think that people must be happy all the time, or we must be focusing on this all the time. You need the combination. So could you construct an algorithm that make people sufficiently unhappy so that you can make them happy again, so that they're more happy with you than with anybody else? So could you essentially outperform your competitors with unhappiness, but then have a better way to recover from unhappiness? So can you fix your client if you charge him a certain price and you know the market is changing, and you're going to keep large groups of people happy by changing your price or changing your engagement method or changing what you push into whatever point within a particular time frame? That means that you want to find what that equilibrium is per customer, because what will make one person unhappy and one group and collective unhappy might make a collective happy, because you've got cultural and other dimensions that you want to be able to track in real time to help you to figure that out. So that is the background to what I wanted to talk about today. I mean, we can talk about a bunch of other things around the technology that the next few slides, and I know that we're out of time, but I just wanted to give a glimpse of what all of this means and how that could be used. And maybe just one last slide that is entirely our punt, and maybe just to give you a quick view of this, means that you need a real-time engagement mechanism. You need a technology that you can deploy that can fit within your digital ecosystem or your human ecosystem, engage with humans that are the recipients of whatever you're going to be doing, and make sure that you can construct and deploy algorithms that can sufficiently test if people are happy or unhappy based on your hypothesis of happiness. So if you have an hypothesis of happiness around how people drive, say, an economic involvement or a group involvement or a social relationship or whatever your measures are, you want to have control over that. And you want to have a means by which you can include other tests. And you want to be able to explore opportunities, not just exploit what you think you know about that human target that you are dealing with. And you want to be able to do it transparently, so you can educate the recipient in saying that I am presenting you with this option, but at the same time, I'm learning about you to service you better. And you want to be able to track how you engage with them in real time. And you want to be able to nudge and give feedback in real time. And that means that we know that humans behave sporadically, and you want to be able to handle that and respond to that. That humans don't know exactly what they want or need. You want to be continuously figuring out what those boundaries are. We know that humans love to be surprised by greatness. They want great products, great services, but not everybody. Some people want what you've done before. You want to also know that humans want to think for themselves. Allow them to provide you with options back that you can track to be able to respond to them as an individual within the context of their social structure. And lastly, you want to make sure that humans want to control their own world. Can you get to a point where it's not just highly consistent, the same thing that everybody else sees in the same way, and it's just focused on a particular output? So how do you rethink that engagement style using a technology? And that's our pursuit. We're in pursuit of finding the engine that can drive the ultimate engagement so that happiness is a consequence. And you have an ability to configure that, tweak that, and handle that. Whatever social method that you want to use that is your hypothesis of happiness can be implemented so you can engage. That's really it from me.
Thank you very much. Any questions, comments, open to the floor?
Yeah, I've just wanted to point out with regards to the concept of happiness in terms of business approaches. You need to understand that, or at least what the trend is at the moment is with regards to personalization. And that happiness itself is just as diverse as individuals, or at least just as diverse as multiple personalities. And like, for example, could you approach and appeal to somebody's happiness by giving them free offers? Not necessarily, because it depends. If they're a race car driver and they're sponsored, they're constantly being given things. It's not really gonna, but if you look at somebody who's more like the breadwinner or the family coordinator, the individual that just gives, it would be nice for them to receive something in return. Now that's looking at it a little bit more demographically, but yeah, just understanding what happiness means per person.
I think that's a great point. I think that you can't make an assumption that the things that make me happy is going to make you happy, because it's a life experience, personality. It's very much dependent on who you are as a person. Anybody else? There must be somebody with a counter view. Paul?
All right, so there's one universal truth that you may disagree with that I have unpacked, and choices make people unhappy. And I've realized if you've got a big menu, you'll get more upset than if you've got 3 items on the menu. And I apply this throughout in my life. If you've got to choose between 10 pairs of shoes and 1 pair of shoes, it contradicts the consumerism. But I start to think, if you look at that phone, Microsoft might have been trying to give you everything, and Apple said, well, we're going to give you one thing. Just understand that universal truth, and maybe true on it when it comes to people and engagement. Maybe by eliminating options, you actually make people happy. And for social science, what I found is some people have enjoyed government will decide for me. My company will tell me, they've actually enjoyed, pushing away having to make choices. And yeah, that's the only thing I can add. Very enlightening. Thanks, John.
Paul, maybe here's the thing then for you. Do you then think that the ultimate point of happiness is to have you being presented with only one option, if you're a personality that wants, a decision to be made for you, or to present it with 2 options if you want to just be able to select between A or B? Isn't that then the Holy Grail?
Yeah, exactly. So I think having option A and B makes you think you have choice, but don't have option A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because then you just get anxious and upset about it.
So that means you need a real-time recommender that will track your behavior and make recommendations exactly based on who you are at that point in time with what you need. So that's basically the case for it, isn't it?
That's exactly. It's like narrowing down all those options from that menu. If everybody knows you're a vegetarian, instead of giving you a full menu of veggie options, you just get 3 options on the menu and you decide which one works for you. It's easy.
But give me the option though. Don't be YouTube that says we'll only have hard rock playing now because you only listen to hard rock. Make me think I have the option of classical at least as well. But don't give me rap and classical and whatever else, orchestra and duets and stuff. Just make me think I have an option. Yeah. Otherwise I'll be dispowered. But don't give me too many. That does make people unhappy.
So Paul, what really makes me unhappy is when my clothing T-shirt recommender recommends any shirt color other than black.
So it's a very interesting topic, something that I've been thinking about a long time as well. And what's really close to understanding happiness, like you said, is to understand to be unhappy, because you can't be happy if you don't understand what is unhappy. So it will be interesting to understand how do you implement that in the business environment. So if you want to make a customer happy, you mentioned you need to push the boundaries around unhappiness. That kind of thing for me is, how do you see that? I don't know if there's time to elaborate, but that's for me, it's very interesting.
I can maybe ask Eric to talk a bit about that. And one of the ways in which we do it is that we run explore, exploit-based algorithms. That is, a lot of it is fairly historically known in this discipline. But you want to be able to keep on exploring the boundaries of what a person will not like. And that means that will not like might mean that you will present him with options that will make them unhappy because they are just not interested in engaging. If the degree of unhappiness is because of who you are, then it's a very different nudge and situation to solve. So if they're unhappy with your brand and with your entire ethos of how you deal with them, then it is very difficult to fix that because you need to make a systemic change. But as soon as you deal with something that is more measurable and narrow, then it becomes a lot more focused. So if you wanted to offer somebody a banking product or a telephony product or a retail store or some product, you can definitely start testing things that are far outside of what they would or would not like.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. But I wanted to mention something that didn't actually, I was surprised I didn't see it, but what about neurochemistry?
Yes.
And the fact that we know the happy chemicals.
Yes.
And we know the one that can be rigged, which is serotonin, because it's the only one that's absorbed by the gut.
Yes.
You also know that social media products make people happy, at least in the short term, and phones, simply because of dopamine and the addictive properties.
Yes.
So from a data perspective, I think it's really interesting. I read a book last year, Habits of a Happy Brain.
Yes.
And I realized that if you can track these levels of neurochemicals, you definitely like to now to better understand their product and the things that they've come out in recent weeks. They've realized the users enjoy that control that they have over their followers.
Yes.
So everyone gets more dopamine. They get that dopamine feedback when their likes increase.
Yes.
And if you can encourage people who want to monetize that, they now have super followers. I think they came out with just last week, like super followers and something else. So I think looking at the neurochemistry and that sort of like provides a direct link to behavioral action and happiness.
Yes.
That's a very linear, straight line for business development.
Definitely. The question is just, what do you use as evidence?
I think there's a thing to think about, which is, do you want to think about happiness in the moment or like lifetime happiness? As a person, you can probably make yourself, at the sort of basic level, like if you just eat a lot of sugar all the time, you'll be happy in the immediate moment, but then you're going to get diabetes and all the health conditions, and if you look at your lifetime, you're probably less happy than you could be. And I think you can see it coming through in the social media space as well, with all the backlash in the US, like they've maximized short-term happiness and got a lot of dopamine kick in the brain. But how do you trade that off against what makes you happy now is not always what's going to maximize your happiness over your lifetime. And I think that applies both to a person and to the way that you treat your customers. Making someone as happy as possible in the next 5 minutes on social media turns out, we can see now that's maybe not the best approach to take if you want like a sustainable model.
No, I think that's a great point, because the thing around any neuro-related research is that unless, and we did this in California State in LA, actually, we did a study on this. We had headsets that track your neuro behaviors and basically how you physically think about the world around you, other than just looking at the theory of how you would use neuromessaging or something that has got to do with it will affect your chemical state. But looking at the actual actions that you would take when certain colors flash or certain kind of pictures are presented to you and how your brain profiles change. The thing is, that's instrumentation. So a large part of what we talked about today is that how would a business at large deal with the instrumentation? What is the data point and what is the data collection mechanism that you can reliably use to influence a particular community in the context of happiness? So in a generic sense, the dopamine-based research, and even if you think of in San Francisco, how we typically think about it, is that, yes, you do that research on subjects. So you'll have subjects, and what you will do, you'll present certain actions to them and certain items to them, and you will observe their neurological behavior. And you'll be able to see that, yes, they can or they cannot deal with what you present to them. And you will use progressive exposure, or what's known as systematic desensitization, to be able to get them closer and deeper into the journey that you want to take them on. And that's all kind of measured. But at the end of the day, it's fine theoretically. What do you do once you want to take action on it, what is the data point that you're going to use to show you the evidence of what it is that that person has done or not done?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Thank you so much for the talk. I appreciate it. I was curious, and I joined the meeting late, so forgive me if you already covered this, but what does happiness look like, and what would you recommend companies do with the hybrid model or remote work, and how does that correlate to happiness with their workers moving forward?
Listen, I've been involved in California with Innovation for Jobs in a few communities, and we have discussed some of this recently again. And I don't know if you probably followed the news in the US. There was basically a news article, I think it was New York Times, published something in the last day or so, saying that they're calling it the Great Resignation. It means that we're entering an era where people are essentially going to, and somebody earlier, Paul said about choices, people are starting to make lifestyle choices over choices around work and the commute and the life that you normally would live inside a cubicle in relation to what you would do in offline work. So we don't personally have any data on that, unfortunately, Alan. It's a deeply interesting subject. We do theorize about it, but we don't have specific data. So we've not seen in the companies that we work with if there's any specific movement, because the sample sets have not been big enough. But I definitely think it's going to have a big impact on how we see ourselves and our kind of work environment in general. What we have done, we've taken a 3-layer view, conditions of work, and attempting to understand how people engage with their work environment and to see if there are changes in engagement. We take a view from the bottom up that's essentially looking at technological activity in the context of what machinery and tooling is available and what are the data points and evidence of work that is the output of whatever process was executed in the business. We then take middle layer view to understand organized work is when people do data capture or they engage with a system that is business specific or purpose driven. And when we map those two, we can get an understanding as to the volume of work within a setting, and we build graphs around that. So we take closeness centralities to understand the centralities around topics of specialization, and we look at between the centralities to understand how different communities connect with each other. We take boundary spanners to understand the people on the periphery. We look at various algorithms to work out how organized work gets done. We then take unorganized communication, and we want to understand then what the rework rates are across that. So we take email communication and voice communication within the company that have been transcribed and then map it back onto the actual work. And from there, if you think of happiness could mean that somebody works at a highly efficient kind of pace and they get their job done. So you can see that they consistently perform work, and you can see people that perform work late in the afternoon or early in the morning. So again, so there are different probably methods that we've been using, but we don't know necessarily if those are the only practices, because there are so many ways to solve this problem.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Jay. I really appreciate that. Thanks, team, for helping Jay put the presentation together, and we will see you next week, Jay.